I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, trying to make sense of what happened over the past year and a half. I met my girlfriend at a local music festival. She was the friend of a friend, and we clicked instantly over our shared love of Broadway musicals. She had this infectious energy about her, this drive that made her stand out. A successful marketing executive at 27, she seemed to have everything figured out. But relationships are never as simple as they appear at first glance. Looking back, there were signs from the beginning that should have warned me. My friends noticed it before I did. How she'd keep everyone at arm's length, how she'd withdraw at the slightest hint of emotional intimacy. I learned later that she'd never had a relationship last longer than 8 weeks before me. She'd always find a reason to end things when they started getting serious. She was dealing with her own battles. I admired how she was trying to better herself, even if she mainly focused on her professional growth rather than emotional development. About 6 months into our relationship, we took a trip to visit her family in a small coastal town. It was a big step, meeting her parents and her childhood friends, Sarah and Tom, who she'd known since high school. The weekend was perfect. Her parents welcomed me warmly. A few months later, I heard that a theater company was putting on a show that held special meaning for both of us. It was the first musical she'd ever seen with her parents, and I'd been part of the crew for my college production. I thought it would be perfect to recreate that magical evening, maybe even make it a tradition. I suggested we could take her parents again, or invite Sarah and Tom. But she shut the idea down immediately, saying she didn't want to see that particular show again. I didn't push it. That's one thing I learned early in our relationship. Pushing never worked. She needed space, needed to feel like she was in control of every situation. I respected that. Things started getting complicated last week. I was running late to meet her at our favorite brewery. Traffic was horrible, and I ended up being 15 minutes behind schedule. She was furious. The kind of fury that came out as ice-cold silence. I've seen her end relationships over similar things before, so I spent the entire evening trying to make it up to her. Eventually, we managed to salvage the night with takeout and movies at my place. The next morning, she said she wasn't feeling well and wanted to go home to rest. I offered to stay and take care of her. After all, she'd just had a severe migraine a few days earlier that landed her in the ER. Plus, her sister had recently had a baby who was having some health issues, so I was worried about her stress levels. But she insisted she just needed some alone time. Usually, even on our quiet days apart, we'd exchange memes and cat photos constantly. But that day, complete silence. My messages went unopened. As the hours passed, I made a decision I'm not proud of. I checked her location on my phone. What I saw shocked me. She wasn't at home resting. She was in the theater, at the very show she'd said she didn't want to see. I knew she was probably with Sarah and Tom. They always went to that fancy Italian place near the theater before shows, the kind of place that needs reservations weeks in advance. This wasn't some spontaneous decision. She'd planned this, deliberately excluded me, and then lied about it. The betrayal wasn't about the show itself. I wouldn't have minded if she wanted to go with her friends. It was the lying that cut deep. I spent days wrestling with how to bring it up. With her, every conversation about feelings felt like defusing a bomb. One wrong move, and everything would explode. She'd shut down completely if she felt criticized, and expressing my feelings usually led to her withdrawing even further. She'd threatened to end things over much smaller issues before. After much thought, I decided to bring it up during our planned dinner date that Wednesday. But before I could, everything unraveled in a completely different way. On Tuesday, she texted me about some work drama. Her boss had sent her a frustrating email. I responded with what I thought was a supportive message, basically saying her boss was being unreasonable, and she had every right to be upset. Her response? "Is that all you got from what I said?" I was dealing with my own work crisis and headache, so I just doubled down on my initial response. In hindsight, maybe I should have called her. But honestly, I was tired of always having to be the one to figure out what she really needed. She never just came out and asked for what she wanted. For hours later, I got a text that made my stomach drop. "I need some space to think about our relationship. I don't feel emotionally supported." I couldn't believe it. I pointed out that she never actually asks for emotional support. She just expects me to somehow know exactly what she needs without her saying a word. I explained, for what felt like the 100th time, that I'm not a mind reader. If she needs something specific from me, she needs to communicate that. "This is exactly the argument I didn't want to have," she texted back. "I need space." I gave her the space she asked for, adding only that I loved her. The next morning, She asked to come over after work to talk. Then silence again. Soon after, I discovered I was blocked on all social media. It was like a slap in the face, but strangely, it was also the wake-up call I needed. For the first time, I started seeing clearly how unhealthy our dynamic had become. When she finally came over, the conversation started with communication issues. According to her, in a truly compatible relationship, partners should just instinctively know what the other person needs without asking. She explained how overwhelming it was for her to ask for help, how it went against her need to feel independent, how she feared becoming like her parents who had a codependent relationship. I tried to explain how unrealistic and unfair it was to expect me to read her mind and carry all the emotional responsibility in our relationship. But as usual, when the conversation got uncomfortable for her, she changed the subject. Suddenly, she was saying she didn't feel like she really knew me, that I was too closed off. Coming from someone who rarely asked me anything about myself or showed interest in my hobbies, this felt like a cruel joke. I was always the one making an effort to learn about her interests, while mine were consistently dismissed. When I brought up the fact that we had no plans for living together after a year of dating, despite my attempts to discuss our future, she went quiet. That particular kind of quiet that meant she was shutting down again. When she came back from her mental shutdown, I started explaining where I was coming from. I tried to tell her about how losing my dad 3 years ago and ending my previous engagement due to my ex's addiction issues had shaped what I wanted from life: stability, genuine connection, a true partnership. But before I could finish, she cut me off, suggesting maybe I'd started dating too soon after my dad's death. That comment knocked the wind out of me. When I finally gathered myself, I brought up the theater incident. The shock on her face when I mentioned knowing about it was almost satisfying, but it quickly turned into another shutdown. After some prodding, she admitted she'd planned it before I even asked about going. She'd lied because she thought I'd pressure her into letting me join. When I asked for examples of when I'd ever pressured her, all she could come up with was how I occasionally asked to watch movies that meant something to me. Like last Christmas, when I wanted to watch It's a Wonderful Life, a tradition I'd shared with my dad. She'd refused, making me feel foolish for even asking. Beyond that, she couldn't name a single instance of me pressuring her. The conversation kept circling back to her belief that the right person would just naturally make everything easy. No work needed. No growth required. According to her, our relationship was causing her too much stress, affecting her work and her health. But when I listed everything I'd done for her, driving her around for months when her car broke down, staying at the hospital during her surgery recovery, helping her move on short notice, covering most of our dates, even lending her money when she needed it, she had no response. I pointed out how I rarely got to choose our activities, how she showed zero interest in my passions, how she'd reject even simple requests for emotional support, and how I constantly had to forgive her silent treatments and angry outbursts while always working on myself to be a better partner. Her only response? Our communication styles aren't compatible. Even then, I offered to try couples counseling. She refused, saying she was too exhausted to try anymore. Throughout this entire conversation, she remained eerily calm while I fought back tears. A week later, drunk and missing her, I made the mistake of texting to ask if we could talk. Her response was brutal. Contact me again, and I'll get a restraining order. Get help and leave me alone. The weeks since then have been rough. I've realized how little I felt valued or respected throughout our relationship. All those times I made excuses for her behavior because of her past trauma or lack of relationship experience. I can see now how much I was compensating, how much I was compromising myself just to keep us afloat. What hurts most isn't losing her. It's realizing that I lost myself somewhere along the way. Her constant criticism and my endless efforts to meet impossible standards chipped away at my self-worth bit by bit. The cruel irony is that breaking up with my ex-fiancé, even with all that trauma, didn't leave me feeling as hollow as this relationship did. I've started therapy again. My therapist says it's common for people who've experienced loss to overcorrect by accepting less than they deserve in relationships, desperately trying to make things work even when they're clearly broken. It's a hard pill to swallow, but I know she's right. I guess sometimes the hardest part of loving someone is learning when to stop making excuses for them and start making changes for yourself.